Libra, let me ask you something, and answer this honestly. When was the moment you stopped explaining yourself to the one who hurt you? Not because you gave up, but because something inside you finally went quiet. I'm asking you, not everyone, because lately your energy feels different, calmer, more contained, and strangely, harder to reach. Here's the truth most people won't say out loud. When you stop circling someone, they feel it. Not in their heart first, but in their power. This isn't about revenge. It's about a shift, a subtle one. The kind that happens when a Libra finally chooses balance within, instead of holding it for someone else. If this resonates, comment "I feel it" below. And ask yourself this quietly. What changed in you before everything else began to change? Trust yourself, Libra. All right, stay right here with me. Because when you stopped explaining yourself, something subtle happened that most people never talk about. And I want to talk to you about it. Not as a reader, not as someone standing above the story, but as a friend who has watched this moment arrive quietly. You see, Libra, silence like that isn't empty. It's not passive, it's not weakness, it's a recalibration. For a long time, you were the one translating feelings, softening edges, finding the words no one else could find. You carried the emotional weight so conversations could keep going, so harmony could survive another night. And then one day, you didn't. Not because you ran out of love, but because you realized love shouldn't require constant explanation. I remember thinking how strange it felt at first. That quiet, almost uncomfortable, like stepping out of a noisy room and realizing your ears are still ringing. You kept waiting for the urge to speak up again, to fix it, to clarify, to balance the scales one more time. But the urge didn't come back, and that's when things began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for you to notice that your chest felt lighter, your breath a little deeper, your thoughts less tangled around someone else's reactions. Here's something I don't hear many people say, but it matters. When a Libra stops explaining, it usually means they've stopped negotiating their self-worth. And that changes the entire atmosphere around them. The world responds to internal posture before it responds to words. People feel when you're no longer available to be misunderstood. They sense when you've stepped out of the role of emotional mediator and back into yourself. That's not karma doing something to someone else. That's alignment doing something for you. And alignment is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It just rearranges the energy in the room. You may have noticed moments where people didn't quite know how to approach you anymore. Conversations paused longer than usual. Messages felt slightly off rhythm. Not wrong, just different. That's because you weren't leaning forward anymore. You were standing centered. And standing centered can feel unfamiliar when you've spent years reaching outward to keep the peace. Let me ask you something gently. When you think back to that moment you chose silence, did it feel like giving up? Or did it feel like coming home? Because there's a difference, and Libra, you know it when you feel it. What you did wasn't withdrawal, it was discernment. You didn't shut down your heart, you stopped overextending it. That's a form of maturity many people never reach. And as this new balance settles in, you may sense the story around you beginning to rearrange itself. Not loudly, not urgently, but with intention. So stay with me. Because what happens next isn't about the past knocking again. It's about how the room feels when you no longer sit where you used to. And that is where the real shift starts. Stay with me for a moment longer, Libra. Because after that silence settled in, after you stopped reaching for balance outside yourself, something almost invisible began to move. It didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic shift, no clear signal that said, "This is karma at work." In fact, if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it entirely. That's how real balance changes. Quietly, without asking for permission. You see, karma isn't loud the way movies make it seem. It doesn't arrive with consequences crashing through the door. Most of the time, it arrives as relief, as a soft exhale you didn't realize you were holding. It comes the moment you stop needing to win, not because you lost interest, but because you finally understood that peace is not a competition. While someone from your past may still be moving, searching, switching scenes, trying on new roles, new stories, new reflections of themselves, you weren't doing any of that. You stayed still, but not stuck. There's a difference most people don't recognize. Stuck energy feels heavy. Stillness feels grounded. You didn't freeze, you rooted. And from that place, the balance began to shift. Not in your favor versus theirs, but in truth. I've watched this happen before. When a Libra stops adjusting themselves to keep the scales even, the world doesn't collapse, it recalibrates. Suddenly, conversations feel different. People hesitate. They feel your presence before they hear your words. Because you're no longer leaning, you're centered. And when you're centered, the dynamics around you have to reorganize. Not because you demand it, but because they can't pull you off balance anymore. Here's something worth sitting with. Movement doesn't always mean progress. Sometimes it's just distraction wearing confidence. And stillness doesn't always mean waiting. Sometimes it's clarity finally taking shape. You may notice that the energy between you and certain people has changed. Not colder, just more honest. There's less chasing, less explaining, less emotional noise. In its place, there's space to breathe, space to notice how you actually feel when no one is pulling on you. That's when the scales tip. Not because someone else did something wrong, but because you stopped compensating for what wasn't aligned. Let me ask you something gently. When you look at your life right now, does it feel quieter or does it feel clearer? Because those are not the same thing. And Libra, clarity is a form of power you've always had. You just don't always claim it. This shift doesn't require action. It requires presence. It asks you to stay exactly where you are without reaching backward or rushing forward. And as you do, the story continues to move, not away from you, around you. So keep listening. Because when balance changes this quietly, the next thing that happens often surprises everyone involved, including you. And here is the part most people misunderstand, Libra. So stay close. Because this is where the story deepens. What they're feeling now isn't nostalgia. It isn't love suddenly waking up in the middle of the night. It's something more uncomfortable than that. It's absence. Not your physical absence, but the absence of your orbit. For a long time, you moved around them without realizing it. You adjusted your timing, your tone, your emotional temperature. You were the quiet center that made their world feel stable, even when it wasn't. And when that stopped, the silence didn't feel peaceful to them. It felt destabilizing. You see, Libra, some people don't recognize balance as balance. They experience it as entitlement. They get used to being the reference point, the axis everything turns around. So when you step back into your own center, they don't feel abandoned. They feel unseated. That's the power shift. And it's subtle enough that it confuses even them. They may not be able to name it. They may tell themselves a different story. But somewhere beneath the surface, they feel the space you no longer fill for them. Not the love, the leverage. I know that word can sound harsh, but listen carefully. Leverage isn't manipulation. It's influence born from consistency. You were consistent. You showed up. You held the emotional structure steady. And now that structure has changed. So when they sense you're no longer adjusting your weight to keep them upright, it unsettles them. They feel it in pauses between messages, in conversations that don't land the same way, in the quiet realization that you're no longer watching for their reactions. That's not jealousy. That's disorientation. Because for the first time, they are responding to you instead of you responding to them. Let me share something personal with you. I've seen this moment arrive in many lives, and it always looks the same. The one who stayed centered doesn't feel triumphant. They feel calm, almost neutral, while the one who lost the center feels restless. They reach, they test the space, they try to understand what shifted without admitting that it was internal. This is why it can feel confusing for you, Libra. You're not trying to pull anything back. You're not sending signals. You're not making moves. Yet somehow the energy is louder. That's because clarity has a presence, even when it's quiet. Ask yourself something gently. When you imagine them sensing you now, does it feel like you're calling them? Or does it feel like you've simply stopped holding the door open? Because those are very different things. And Libra, you know the difference. This isn't about reclaiming power over someone else. It's about returning power to yourself. And when that happens, people who benefited from your imbalance feel it immediately. Not as loss, as contrast. So stay grounded here. Don't rush to interpret. Don't rush to respond. Just notice. Because when someone feels the shift before they understand it, their next move often reveals more than any words ever could. And that's where the story begins to turn again. And this is where it becomes unmistakable, Libra. Not louder, not dramatic, just unmistakable. Because there's a role you're no longer stepping into. And the moment you stopped playing it, the entire dynamic shifted. For so long, you were the one smoothing the edges, reading the room before anyone else noticed the tension, pausing your own reactions so someone else could feel comfortable first. You carried the unspoken agreement that if balance was going to exist, you would be the one to hold it. You were the mediator, the one who waited, the one who stayed calm when things felt uneven. And I don't say that lightly. That takes intelligence, emotional skill, a deep instinct to keep the peace. But here's the part most people never tell a Libra. That role slowly teaches others that your presence is a service, not a choice, not a gift, just something they can lean on without asking. And one day you felt it. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet recognition. You realized you were carrying emotions that were never yours to manage. You were repairing fractures you didn't cause, explaining behavior that didn't align with your values. So you stepped out of the role, not with a speech, not with confrontation, just with stillness. And that's when the wobble began. Because when the mediator leaves the room, imbalance becomes visible. When the one who waited stops waiting, others feel rushed by their own uncertainty. When the one who held space steps back into themselves, the room feels unfamiliar. This is where karma actually turns, not as punishment, but as exposure. You didn't remove anything from them. You removed yourself from a position you were never meant to occupy alone. That's why things may feel slightly off now. Why certain people seem unsettled, why conversations no longer flow the way they used to. They're not reacting to you. They're reacting to the absence of the role you once played for them. And Libra, that's not cruelty. That's correction. Let me share something personal with you. Every time I've seen someone release a role like this, there's a moment of doubt. A soft question that rises up late at night. Am I being selfish now? Am I being cold? Am I changing too much? But what's really happening is simpler than that. You're no longer cushioning reality for others. And reality has weight. Ask yourself this gently. If you stopped holding everything together, did things fall apart? Or did they simply reveal where the balance was missing? Because those are very different outcomes. You're not withdrawing love, you're withdrawing labor, emotional labor that was never acknowledged as work. And that frees you. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to feel the ground under your feet again. As you settle into this new position, you may sense the atmosphere changing. Not rushing toward you, not pulling away, just adjusting. That adjustment is important, because what comes next doesn't depend on who notices your absence. It depends on how you occupy your presence now. So stay here with yourself for a moment longer. Feel what it's like to stand without leaning, to breathe without monitoring anyone else's reaction. Because once you stop playing the old role, the story doesn't end. It opens into something entirely different. And somewhere in the middle of all this settling, Libra, without announcements, without fireworks, something new begins to register. Not as a person rushing in, not as a story demanding attention, more like a change in temperature. You feel it first in your body, a sense of ease you did not have to earn, a calm that does not require explanation. This is not the kind of energy that sweeps you off your feet. It does not dazzle. It does not interrupt your life. It fits. And that is how you know this is different. I want to be very clear with you here, as a friend. This is not a love story yet. And it doesn't need to be. Because what is entering your space now isn't here to rescue you from anything. It is not here to fix your past or rewrite old endings. It arrives quietly, like someone taking a seat beside you without shifting the furniture. You may notice that around this presence, you do not monitor yourself. You do not rehearse your words. You do not check the balance every few seconds to see who owes what. There is no performance, and for a Libra, that is rare. You have spent so much of your life adjusting the atmosphere, making sure everyone is comfortable, making sure the scales are even. This new dynamic does not require that effort. It allows you to rest in your natural symmetry. That is the value here. Not excitement, not intensity, safety. And safety does not mean boredom. It means your nervous system finally recognizes the room as non-threatening. You are not asked to prove your worth. You are not asked to explain your intentions. You are not asked to shrink or stretch to be understood. You are simply met. That can feel unfamiliar at first, even suspicious. When you are used to earning connection, ease can feel undeserved. You might catch yourself waiting for the moment when the other shoe drops. But notice this: nothing drops. Conversations remain steady. Silences do not feel heavy. Time does not feel rushed or stalled. This is how alignment often enters a Libra's life. Not with grand declarations, but with relief. And here is the most important part. This energy is not asking you to choose anything yet. It is simply showing you what life feels like when you are not compensating for imbalance. That alone is healing. Ask yourself something softly. When you imagine continuing forward in this calm, does it feel dull or does it feel honest? Because honesty can be quiet, and quiet can be powerful. I want you to hear this clearly. This is not about replacing anyone. It is about recognizing that connection doesn't have to cost you your center. And as you sit with this new dynamic, without naming it, without defining it, without rushing it into a story, you may notice something else beginning to stir. A subtle reaction from the past. A movement from a place you thought had already settled. Not because you called it back, but because when you stop over-functioning, what no longer fits becomes obvious. Stay, present here. Stay grounded in what feels steady, because the next shift doesn't arrive from the outside. It rises from how the past responds when it realizes you are no longer waiting in the same place. And just as you begin to settle into that calm, Libra, just as your body learns this new rhythm, the past stirs. Not loudly, not apologetically. It doesn't arrive with insight or accountability in its hands. It arrives with memory. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They think the past comes back because it has grown, because it has learned, because it finally sees the truth. But most of the time, it returns for a simpler reason. The balance shifted, and it feels unfamiliar to the one who benefited from the old arrangement. I want to say this to you gently, as a friend who has watched this pattern repeat. When someone reaches back after you stop overgiving, it is rarely about love rediscovered. It is about equilibrium lost. They sense that you are no longer where you used to be, not waiting, not adjusting, not softening the edges of their uncertainty. And that unsettles them, because before, the scale leaned toward them without effort. You carried more weight, so things could feel even. Now, you are standing somewhere else entirely, centered, present, unavailable for old dynamics. So the past tries to rebalance itself, not by meeting you where you are, but by pulling you back to where you were. This can come in many forms: familiar words, sudden warmth, reminders of shared history. Sometimes even vulnerability that feels convincing at first. But listen closely to the energy beneath it. Is there curiosity about who you have become? Or is there discomfort with who you are no longer willing to be? That distinction matters, because true change moves toward you slowly, with humility, with listening. But imbalance rushes, it reaches, it tries to restore what once felt predictable. You may feel a moment of confusion here, a soft tug at your heart. Not because you want to return, but because you recognize the pattern. And recognition can feel like temptation. Let me offer you something grounded. You do not owe clarity to anyone who is reacting to your growth. You do not owe reassurance to someone who is unsettled by your stability. This is not punishment. It is not coldness. It is simply reality adjusting to your new posture. The past is responding to contrast. You are no longer available to carry both sides of the scale. And without that compensation, the imbalance becomes obvious. That can look like regret, or longing, or sudden interest. But underneath it all is a desire to restore a familiar order. Ask yourself something quietly. If nothing had changed inside you, would this moment be happening at all? Or is it arriving precisely because you are no longer standing in the same place? You are not doing anything wrong by noticing this. You are not responsible for fixing it. All you are asked to do now is observe, without rushing, without responding from habit. Just notice how it feels to be approached from your new center, because this moment is not about deciding anything yet. It is about understanding where you stand. And once you see that clearly, what comes next will not be pulled by the past. It will be shaped by the choice you are finally ready to make. And this is where something inside you steadies, Libra. Not hard, not defensive, just clear. Because for the first time, the choice in front of you doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't feel heavy with history. It doesn't arrive wrapped in urgency or fear. It feels quiet. And that's how you know this choice is different. Before, decisions came tangled with memory, with late nights replaying conversations, with the weight of what you shared and what you survived together. You chose from a place that asked, What do we owe each other now? But listen to yourself today. Your body is no longer bracing. Your breath moves without interruption. Your mind is not bargaining with the past. That matters more than you think. Because clarity doesn't shout, it settles. This time you are not choosing to save something. You are choosing how you want to live inside yourself. That's a profound shift. I want to say something honestly, as someone who cares about you. Not every return deserves a reunion. Not every familiar voice deserves access to the life you are rebuilding. And that doesn't make you cruel. It makes you conscious. You are no longer asking, "Can this work again?" You are asking, "Can I stay whole here?" That question changes everything. You notice how your shoulders respond to certain names, how your chest tightens or softens at the thought of certain conversations. You listen to your body instead of overriding it for the sake of harmony. And Libra, that is wisdom earned. There is a difference between forgiveness and permission, between understanding and reopening a door, between compassion and self-abandonment. You don't have to explain that difference to anyone. You only have to live it. This is not about rejecting the past. It is about not living there anymore. When someone returns now, you see them clearly, not as who they were, not as who you hoped they might become, but as who they are meeting you as today. And from that clarity, the answer often reveals itself without effort. You feel it in your breath, in the way your body either relaxes or contracts, in whether you can imagine yourself staying expanded instead of shrinking to fit. Let me ask you something gently. If you never spoke another word about what happened, would your choice still feel right? Because that is how you know it's coming from truth, not reaction. This moment is not dramatic. It is grounded. And grounded choices tend to last. You are not choosing against anyone. You are choosing for yourself. That distinction frees you from guilt. It releases you from the old story where love meant sacrifice without limits. This is love with boundaries, connection with consent, presence without performance. And as you stand here, balanced in a way that belongs to you, you may sense the energy around you settling into a new order, not because you forced it, but because you finally honored where you stand. So take a breath here. Let this choice rest in your body before it ever becomes action. Because what comes next is not about who stays or who goes. It is about where everything finally lands when you stop carrying more than your share. And that landing, that quiet arrival, is where the deeper meaning of all this begins to reveal itself. And this is where everything comes to rest, Libra. Not with noise, not with triumph, but with truth. Because karma, real karma, was never a punishment system. It was never about watching someone else fall. It has always been quieter than that, more precise. Karma is simply placement. It places each person exactly where their inner frequency can carry them. No higher, no lower, just honest. And right now, you are standing in a different place than you used to. Not above anyone, not below anyone, just within yourself. That is why it feels calm here. You are no longer trying to prove your worth. You are no longer measuring yourself against someone else's choices. You are no longer competing for space in a story that required you to shrink. And that is why the shift feels clearer to others than it does to you. When you stop struggling, the contrast becomes obvious. When you stop negotiating your value, the room reorganizes itself. Not because you demanded it, but because you finally aligned with yourself. This is where karma actually lands. It lands in the quiet confidence of not needing to explain, in the ease of not needing validation, in the grounded knowing that your life does not need to look dramatic to be meaningful. You may notice something surprising now. You care less about being understood, and more about being at peace. That is not indifference. That is maturity. People who once benefited from your self-doubt may feel unsettled, not because you did anything wrong, but because you are no longer vibrating at a frequency that required compensation. They feel the shift because they are still adjusting to it. You feel it less because you are finally home. Let me tell you something as a friend. Choosing yourself is not a moment. It is a practice. It looks like saying no without guilt, like pausing instead of reacting, like letting silence be enough. It looks like trusting your inner equilibrium even when no one applauds it. And Libra, this is your true gift, not balance for others, but balance within. Ask yourself something softly. If nothing needed to be proven anymore, how would you move through your days? Slower, lighter, more honest. That is where you are now. The karma did not turn because someone lost access to you. It turned because you stopped abandoning yourself. And from that place, life responds differently. Not instantly, not magically, but steadily. You attract what meets you, not what needs you to bend. So take a breath here. Let the story settle into your body. There is nothing you need to chase, nothing you need to defend, nothing you need to win. Just a life that finally feels aligned with who you are becoming. And as you continue forward, quietly, intentionally, you may realize something simple and profound. This was never about them feeling it. It was about you finally feeling yourself. And that is where karma completes its circle. And now, Libra, let's slow this moment down. Just enough to let it land. After everything we've walked through together, here's a quiet observation you might have missed. The moment you stopped needing an outcome, your energy stopped asking for permission. That's not something you announce, it's something people feel. So let me leave you with a question. Not one you need to answer out loud, just one to sit with. What part of your life feels lighter simply because you no longer explain it? Notice your body right now, your shoulders, your breath, that small pause between thoughts. Sometimes clarity doesn't arrive as an answer. It arrives as silence that finally feels safe. Here's a gentle inner practice for tonight. No journaling, no fixing, just this. Before you sleep, place one hand on your chest. Take one slow breath and quietly tell yourself, I do not need to be chosen to be whole. That sentence changes things. I won't tell you what comes next. Because the most meaningful shifts rarely need a preview. But I will say this. When Libra chooses alignment over approval, the journey doesn't end. It softens. It deepens. I've seen this path before. It never rushes. It always reveals itself at the right pace. If something in this message touched you, leave a comment below. Even a single word is enough. It helps this community find each other, and if you feel called, subscribe. Not because you need answers, but because this conversation isn't finished yet. Trust yourself, Libra. The next message is already forming.